"Get your hands off me, you don't belong here." The sergeant's voice cut through the armory like a blade as his fingers dug into her arm, but Lydia Hartwell didn't flinch. She continued reaching for the rifle rack while chaos erupted around them, her steady hands moving with purpose that defied her janitor's uniform. Then she spoke 4 words that changed everything. "Call sign Iron Phoenix." Within seconds, every ranger in the room had dropped their weapons and formed a protective circle around her, their faces showing the kind of respect reserved for legends. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights of Fort Meridian's main armory cast harsh shadows across rows of military equipment as alarm sirens wailed through the concrete corridors. Lydia Hartwell, 34 years old, with auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wore the standard-issue gray coveralls of the base cleaning crew. For 3 years, she had moved through these halls like a ghost, mopping floors, emptying trash bins, and maintaining the spotless standards expected of a military installation. To most personnel, she was practically invisible, just another civilian contractor doing the unglamorous work that kept the base functioning. The soldiers called her the Shadow because of how quietly she went about her duties, appearing and disappearing from rooms without anyone really noticing. She preferred it that way. During shift changes, she would nod politely to passing officers, step aside respectfully when important personnel walked by, and never speak unless spoken to first. Her supervisor often praised her efficiency and reliability, noting in performance reviews that Lydia completed her assigned sectors faster than any previous janitor while maintaining exceptional quality standards. Tonight had started like any other late shift. Lydia was scheduled to clean the administrative buildings and common areas while most of the base slept. She worked methodically through her checklist, emptying wastebaskets in the communications center, mopping the corridors near the officers' quarters, sanitizing the surfaces in the briefing rooms. The base at night had a different energy, quieter, more focused, with only essential personnel maintaining their vigilant watch over the perimeter and facilities. But everything changed at 0237 hours when the emergency klaxons began blaring throughout Fort Meridian. Red warning lights flashed in every hallway as the base-wide intercom crackled to life. "All personnel report to emergency stations. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. Unknown hostile forces have breached the outer perimeter. All civilians report to designated safe zones immediately." Lydia had been cleaning the hallway outside the armory when the announcement echoed through the corridors. She watched as off-duty soldiers rushed past her, some still pulling on their uniforms, others speaking rapidly into handheld radios. The urgency in their voices and the sharp efficiency of their movements told her this was serious, more serious than the routine training exercises she had observed during her 3 years at Fort Meridian. As she stood there with her mop and bucket, trying to decide whether to head to the civilian safe area or continue with her duties, she heard shouting from inside the armory. Through the reinforced glass windows, she could see soldiers frantically attempting to access weapon systems and ammunition. Something was wrong, very wrong. Staff Sergeant Reynolds burst through the armory doors, his face flushed with frustration and panic. "The electronic locks are malfunctioning," he shouted to his team. "The breach must have included a cyber attack. We can't access half the weapon systems, and the manual override codes aren't working." Lydia froze, her janitor's training telling her to stay invisible and out of the way, but something deeper, something she had buried for years, began to stir. She recognized the tactical situation developing, a coordinated attack that combined physical breach with electronic warfare, designed to leave defenders unable to access their own weapons during the crucial first minutes of engagement. "Ma'am, you need to get to the safe zone now," a young private said, noticing her standing in the hallway. His voice was polite but firm, the way soldiers spoke to civilians during emergencies, protective but distant. Lydia nodded and began walking toward the designated civilian area, but with each step, the sounds of growing desperation from the armory pulled at something deep in her chest. She could hear Sergeant Reynolds coordinating with his team, their voices becoming more strained as they struggled with the malfunctioning security systems. Time was running out. If hostile forces had breached the perimeter and the defenders couldn't access their weapons, the entire base was vulnerable. She stopped walking. Her hands, still gripping the mop handle, began to tremble slightly, not from fear but from the internal battle between who she had chosen to become and who she used to be. For 3 years, she had successfully maintained her cover, living quietly as a civilian contractor, avoiding anything that might trigger questions about her background or capabilities. But as she stood in that corridor, listening to the chaos in the armory, and knowing that soldiers' lives hung in the balance, Lydia realized that some responsibilities transcended personal choices about anonymity and peace. Sometimes when everything was falling apart, the only option was to step forward and reveal the person you had worked so hard to hide. She turned around and walked back toward the armory, her cleaning supplies abandoned in the hallway. With each step, her posture changed subtly, the deferential stance of a civilian contractor replaced by something more confident, more purposeful. By the time she reached the armory doors, Lydia Hartwell, the janitor, was already disappearing, replaced by someone whose true identity would shock everyone in that room. Lydia Hartwell had perfected the art of being unremarkable. At 5'4", with a slight build and gentle brown eyes, she moved through Fort Meridian like morning mist, present but barely noticed, efficient but never drawing attention. Her auburn hair was always pulled back in the same practical ponytail, secured with a simple black elastic band that had seen better days. She wore no makeup, no jewelry except for a plain silver watch that she checked frequently during her shifts. Everything about her appearance suggested someone who had chosen invisibility as a survival strategy. The other cleaning staff called her Mouse because of how quietly she worked. Unlike her colleagues who often gathered in break rooms to gossip about base politics or complain about difficult supervisors, Lydia ate lunch alone, reading paperback novels or completing crossword puzzles. When forced into conversation, she spoke softly with a slight Midwestern accent, discussing safe topics like weather or weekend plans, with the kind of pleasant but forgettable demeanor that discouraged deeper inquiry. Her supervisor, Mrs. Patterson, had noted in Lydia's personnel file that she was the most reliable custodial staff member in the building's 20-year history. Never calls in sick, never complains about assignments, completes every task ahead of schedule, Patterson had written during Lydia's last performance review. If we could clone her work ethic, this base would run like clockwork. What Patterson didn't know, what nobody at Fort Meridian knew, was that Lydia's exceptional efficiency came from years of training where attention to detail meant the difference between life and death, where completing objectives ahead of schedule was essential for survival, and where blending into the background was a tactical skill that had kept her alive through multiple deployments. During her 3 years at the base, Lydia had established a routine that bordered on ritualistic. She arrived for her evening shift at exactly 1800 hours, changed into her gray coveralls in the civilian contractor locker room, and began her rounds with the administrative buildings. She worked systematically, methodically, treating each task with the same careful precision, whether she was emptying wastebaskets or sanitizing surfaces in classified briefing rooms. The military personnel she encountered treated her with polite indifference. Officers would nod acknowledgement when she stepped aside to let them pass in narrow corridors. Enlisted soldiers occasionally thanked her for keeping their common areas clean, but rarely made eye contact or engaged in meaningful conversation. She was part of the infrastructure, necessary but invisible, like the heating system or the security cameras. This suited Lydia perfectly. She had specifically chosen night shift work because it minimized her contact with base personnel, while still allowing her to feel connected to the military environment she had once called home. During the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, she could walk through corridors lined with unit insignias and operational maps without anyone questioning why a janitor might pause to study tactical displays with unusual interest. Her small apartment off base reflected the same commitment to anonymity. The furniture was basic, purchased from discount stores and garage sales. The walls held no personal photographs, no military memorabilia, no hints about her past. Her bookshelf contained romance novels, mystery paperbacks, and home improvement magazines, exactly what anyone would expect from a middle-aged woman working a blue-collar job. But hidden in a sealed container at the back of her bedroom closet, wrapped in plastic and stored with military precision, were items that told a different story. A folded flag, 3 bronze stars, a purple heart, and a photograph of 12 soldiers in desert camouflage, their faces young and confident, their eyes bright with the invincibility that comes before you learn how quickly everything can change. At Fort Meridian, Lydia interacted most frequently with the night security guards, who knew her by sight and trusted her enough to unlock secured areas for cleaning. Corporal Davidson, a young soldier from Tennessee, often chatted with her during his patrol rounds. "You ever get lonely working these hours, Miss Hartwell?" he had asked one evening while she cleaned the communications center. "Not really," she had replied, wringing out her mop with practiced efficiency. "I prefer the quiet. Gives me time to think." Davidson had nodded, accepting her response at face value. Like everyone else, he saw exactly what Lydia wanted him to see. A woman who had chosen predictability over excitement, security over adventure, invisibility over recognition. What he couldn't see was how her eyes automatically tracked the tactical radio frequencies displayed on the communications equipment, how she instinctively memorized guard rotation patterns during her cleaning rounds, or how her hands moved with muscle memory born from years of handling equipment far more complex than mops and vacuum cleaners. The soldiers at Fort Meridian lived and worked around someone whose presence they barely registered, never suspecting that the quiet janitor who emptied their trash and cleaned their floors carried knowledge that could save their lives, skills that had once made her legendary among Special Forces units, and a burden of responsibility that had driven her to seek the anonymity she had spent 3 years maintaining. Tonight, as alarm sirens shattered the peaceful routine of her evening shift, that carefully constructed invisibility was about to be tested in ways that Lydia had hoped never to face again. The Armory at Fort Meridian represented the technological heart of modern military preparedness. Located in the base's most secure sector, the facility housed everything from standard-issue rifles to advanced electronic warfare equipment. Reinforced concrete walls 2 feet thick surrounded climate-controlled chambers where millions of dollars worth of weaponry waited in perfect readiness. Biometric scanners, electronic locks, and redundant security systems protected access to equipment that could outfit an entire battalion for extended operations. Staff Sergeant Jake Reynolds had been assigned to Fort Meridian for 18 months, long enough to know every inch of the Armory's layout and every quirk of its security protocols. At 28, he carried himself with the confident swagger of someone who had earned his position through competence rather than politics. His dark hair was regulation short, his uniform pressed to perfection, and his manner with subordinates struck the right balance between authority and approachability. Tonight, Reynolds supervised a team of 6 Rangers, each selected for their expertise with different weapon systems. Specialist Torres handled communications equipment and electronic countermeasures. Sergeant Mitchell specialized in heavy weapons and explosive ordnance. Private First Class Anderson maintained small arms and personal defense systems. The team worked with the synchronized efficiency of professionals who trusted each other completely. Under normal circumstances, accessing weapons during an emergency followed established protocols that could be completed in under 3 minutes. Biometric identification, password verification, manual backup codes, and physical keys provided multiple layers of security that could be bypassed systematically when speed became essential. Reynolds had drilled these procedures countless times, preparing for scenarios ranging from terrorist attacks to natural disasters. But tonight's emergency revealed vulnerabilities that no one had anticipated. The electronic lock systems responded to commands with error messages that made no technical sense. Biometric scanners flickered between green and red status lights without explanation. Communication links with the base security center transmitted only static. Even the backup manual systems seemed to be malfunctioning in ways that suggested deliberate sabotage rather than random equipment failure. "This isn't random system failure," Torres reported, her fingers dancing across diagnostic keyboards with growing frustration. "Someone with serious technical knowledge has compromised our security infrastructure. They've inserted code that creates cascade failures every time we attempt standard override procedures." Mitchell, a burly sergeant with 12 years of military experience, slammed his fist against an unresponsive weapon locker. "How is that possible? These systems are supposed to be isolated from external networks. Air-gapped security should prevent any kind of remote access." Reynolds checked his watch, calculating how much time had passed since the initial breach alarm. Every minute they spent locked out of their own weapons was a minute that hostile forces could use to advance deeper into base territory. Intelligence reports suggested the attackers possessed sophisticated equipment and tactical training that matched or exceeded standard military capabilities. The young Private Anderson, fresh from advanced training programs, voiced what everyone was thinking. "Sir, if we can't access our weapons, how are we supposed to defend the base? The perimeter guards are equipped for routine patrol, not extended combat against professional operators." Outside the Armory, other sections of Fort Meridian buzzed with controlled chaos as personnel implemented emergency procedures that had been rehearsed dozens of times. The communications center maintained contact with regional command headquarters, requesting backup and providing updates on the developing situation. Medical facilities prepared for potential casualties. Administrative staff secured classified documents and activated data destruction protocols in case the base became compromised. Colonel Patricia Hawkins, Fort Meridian's commanding officer, coordinated the overall response from the Emergency Command Center. A veteran of 3 combat deployments, she possessed the kind of calm authority that kept soldiers focused during crisis situations. Her radio crackled with reports from various sectors as she built a comprehensive picture of what they were facing. "Ma'am, the perimeter teams report at least 12 hostile contacts approaching from multiple directions," reported her communications officer. "They're using advanced night vision equipment and moving with tactical precision that suggests special forces training." Hawkins studied the tactical display, showing Fort Meridian's layout. Red markers indicated confirmed enemy positions, while green markers showed friendly force locations. The pattern emerging suggested a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm specific defensive positions while avoiding others entirely. The kind of intelligence-driven attack that required detailed knowledge of the base's capabilities and vulnerabilities. "What's the status on the Armory?" she asked, already knowing that the answer would determine whether Fort Meridian could mount an effective defense or would have to rely on emergency evacuation procedures. Meanwhile, in the civilian quarters, base support staff followed lockdown procedures that kept them safely away from operational areas. Families of military personnel gathered in designated safe rooms, while security teams verified that all civilians were accounted for and protected. The base's elementary school, currently empty due to the late hour, had been converted into an additional safe zone with military police providing security. Dr. Sarah Chen, the base psychologist who had worked with military families for 6 years, helped coordinate civilian evacuations while fighting her own growing anxiety. She had counseled soldiers returning from combat zones and understood the psychological impact of attacks on military installations. The knowledge that hostile forces had penetrated Fort Meridian's defenses created a level of vulnerability that challenged everyone's sense of security. As the minutes ticked by, the situation in the Armory grew more desperate. Reynolds and his team had exhausted every standard procedure for accessing weapons during emergencies. The electronic warfare attack had been more sophisticated than anyone anticipated, creating system failures that seemed impossible to resolve without complete system restoration, a process that would take hours they didn't have. The sound of distant gunfire echoed through the base as perimeter guards engaged hostile forces with their limited personal weapons. Radio chatter indicated that the defenders were outgunned and falling back toward secondary defensive positions. Without access to the Armory's heavy weapons and advanced equipment, Fort Meridian's ability to repel a coordinated assault was severely compromised. It was at this moment of maximum crisis, with alarm sirens wailing and enemy forces advancing, that Lydia Hartwell made her decision to abandon 3 years of careful anonymity and step forward to save the lives of people who had never bothered to learn her name. The explosion that shattered the night air at 02:47 hours changed everything. A massive detonation erupted from the direction of the main communications tower, sending a pillar of orange flame and black smoke into the star-filled sky above Fort Meridian. The blast wave rattled windows throughout the base and triggered secondary explosions as fuel lines ruptured and electrical systems overloaded. Within seconds, the base's primary communication link to regional command went completely dark. Colonel Hawkins felt the floor shake beneath her feet in the emergency command center as sparks showered from overhead light fixtures. Emergency power kicked in immediately, bathing everything in the eerie red glow of backup lighting systems. Her tactical display flickered and died, taking with it the real-time information that had allowed her to coordinate defensive responses. "Communications are down completely, ma'am," reported Lieutenant Foster, his voice tight with controlled panic as he worked frantically at his console. "We've lost contact with regional headquarters, perimeter teams, and half our internal systems. Whatever hit the tower took out our satellite uplinks and radio repeaters." The implications struck Hawkins like a physical blow. Without communications, Fort Meridian was effectively isolated, unable to call for backup or coordinate with friendly forces in the area. The hostile force had demonstrated tactical sophistication by targeting the communications infrastructure first, creating exactly the kind of chaos that would allow them to operate with minimal interference. But the communications tower explosion was only the beginning. At 02:49 hours, the base's main power station erupted in a series of controlled detonations that plunged entire sectors into darkness. Emergency generators kicked in automatically, but they provided only enough power for essential systems, leaving most of the base operating under limited lighting and reduced defensive capabilities. Staff Sergeant Reynolds felt the armory's lights flicker and dim as the backup power systems engaged. The electronic lock displays went completely dark for 30 seconds before emergency power restored minimal functionality. When the systems came back online, every access panel showed the same message: security lockdown initiated, command authorization required. "They've cut our power and communications," Torres reported, her voice reflecting the growing desperation that gripped everyone in the room. "Without full power, the security systems have defaulted to maximum lockdown mode. We can't override anything without direct authorization from command headquarters, and we can't reach command headquarters because our communications are down." The tactical brilliance of the attack became clear to Reynolds as he processed the implications. The hostile force had created a perfect trap: disable communications to prevent calls for help, cut main power to trigger security lockdowns, then attack a base that couldn't access its own weapons. It was the kind of coordinated assault that required extensive intelligence gathering and precise timing. Private Anderson, monitoring the base's internal communication channels, suddenly went pale. "Sir, I'm picking up reports from the motor pool. Someone has destroyed our vehicle fleet. Multiple explosions reported in the garage areas. It sounds like they've taken out our trucks, Humvees, everything." The news hit the team like a sledgehammer. Without vehicles, evacuation options were severely limited. The nearest friendly military installation was 40 miles away across rough terrain that would take hours to traverse on foot, especially with wounded personnel and civilians. Fort Meridian was becoming an isolated fortress under siege, cut off from outside support and unable to mount an effective mobile defense. Mitchell slammed his hand against an unresponsive weapon locker, his frustration boiling over. "This is insane. We're sitting ducks in here, professional soldiers reduced to throwing rocks because we can't open our own damn weapons storage." The sound of automatic weapons fire grew closer, no longer distant pops, but the sharp crack of high-velocity rounds being exchanged near the base's inner perimeter. Radio chatter from surviving handheld units painted a grim picture: perimeter guards falling back under heavy fire, defensive positions being overrun, casualties mounting among personnel armed only with sidearms and personal weapons. Reynolds tried his emergency command codes one more time, entering the sequence that should have granted immediate access to all weapons systems during base-wide emergencies. The system processed his input for several seconds before displaying a message that made his blood run cold. "Authorization denied. Command verification required." "The system won't accept my emergency codes," he reported to his team, his voice betraying the first hints of genuine fear. "According to the computer, my authorization level is insufficient for emergency weapons access. That's impossible. These codes were specifically designed for exactly this situation." Torres looked up from her diagnostic equipment with an expression of growing horror. "Sir, I think I understand what they've done. The cyber attack didn't just disable our systems, it reprogrammed them. The security protocols have been rewritten to require authorization levels that don't exist in our command structure. Even Colonel Hawkins probably couldn't override these locks now." The genius and ruthlessness of the attack plan became fully apparent. The hostile force hadn't simply broken Fort Meridian's defenses. They had turned the base's own security systems against its defenders. Every safeguard designed to protect the weapons had become a barrier preventing their use when they were needed most. Outside the armory, the sounds of battle grew more intense. Explosions echoed through corridors as defenders fell back from position after position. The base's public address system crackled to life, with Colonel Hawkins' voice, calm but urgent. "All personnel implement condition-red defensive procedures, secure all classified materials, and prepare for potential base evacuation. This is not a drill." Reynolds realized they were facing complete tactical disaster. a modern military installation equipped with some of the most advanced weapons in the world, was about to fall to a relatively small attacking force because sophisticated cyber warfare had locked the defenders out of their own arsenal. It was a nightmare scenario that military planners had theorized about, but never fully prepared for. As if summoned by their growing desperation, the armory door opened and Lydia Hartwell stepped inside, still wearing her janitor's coveralls, her eyes scanning the chaotic scene with an intensity that seemed completely at odds with her humble civilian appearance. "Ma'am, you absolutely cannot be in here," Staff Sergeant Reynolds barked, his voice sharp with the kind of authority that had been trained into him over years of military service. He stepped directly into Lydia's path, his broad frame blocking her access to the weapon storage areas. "This is a restricted military facility during an active combat situation. Civilians need to report to designated safe zones immediately." Lydia continued moving forward with quiet determination, her eyes scanning the electronic displays and security panels with an intensity that seemed completely inappropriate for someone in custodial coveralls. "I understand you're having difficulties accessing your weapons systems," she said simply, her voice carrying none of the deference that Reynolds had come to expect from base support staff. "That's classified information," Specialist Torres interjected, moving to flank Lydia from the left side. Her hand rested casually on her sidearm, following standard protocols for dealing with unauthorized personnel in secure areas during emergencies. "Ma'am, I need you to turn around and exit this facility immediately, or we'll be forced to detain you for security purposes." The suggestion that a janitor might somehow help with sophisticated electronic security systems struck the entire team as absurd. Reynolds had spent 18 months learning the intricacies of the Armory's computer systems. Torres held advanced certifications in electronic warfare and cybersecurity. Mitchell had forgotten more about military equipment than most civilians would ever know. The idea that someone who emptied their trash cans could contribute anything meaningful to their crisis seemed almost insulting. "Look, lady," Mitchell said, his patience wearing thin as distant gunfire, reminded everyone how desperate their situation had become. "I appreciate that you want to help, but this isn't a plumbing problem or a broken coffee machine. We're dealing with military-grade electronic warfare systems that have been compromised by professionals. Unless you have a PhD in computer science and 20 years of cybersecurity experience, there's nothing you can do here." Lydia's expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted slightly, a barely perceptible straightening that suggested she was drawing on reserves of confidence that seemed inconsistent with her civilian status. "The attack pattern suggests they've inserted malware that creates recursive authentication loops," she observed quietly. "Your emergency override codes are being validated against corrupted authorization databases that reset themselves every time you attempt access." The technical accuracy of her assessment sent a chill through Torres, who had spent the last hour reaching similar conclusions through detailed diagnostic analysis. How could a janitor understand electronic warfare terminology, much less correctly diagnose sophisticated cyber attack methodologies? How could you possibly know that?" Torres asked, her hand moving instinctively closer to her weapon as her training kicked in. Unauthorized personnel with detailed knowledge of classified security systems represented a potential security threat that demanded immediate investigation. Reynolds stepped closer to Lydia, his voice dropping to the low, dangerous tone that soldiers used when dealing with potential enemy agents. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to explain how a cleaning lady knows anything about military cybersecurity protocols right now." The implied accusation hung in the air like smoke. In the post-9/11 military environment, insider threats were taken seriously. Foreign intelligence agencies had attempted to place operatives in support positions at military installations. The possibility that their janitor might be a spy seemed far more plausible than the idea that she possessed legitimate technical expertise. "You think I'm a security risk," Lydia said, reading the suspicion in their faces with the kind of tactical awareness that seemed completely at odds with her humble appearance. "Yeah, I understand why you would think that, but right now, every minute you spend questioning my background is a minute that hostile forces use to advance deeper into your base." Private Anderson, the youngest member of the team, found himself caught between following orders and recognizing that their current situation was deteriorating rapidly. "Sir, what if she really can help? I mean, we're not exactly succeeding with conventional approaches." "Absolutely not," Reynolds snapped. "We don't take technical advice from unauthorized civilians, especially ones who somehow know classified information they shouldn't have access to. For all we know, she's part of the attack team, sent in to sabotage our remaining defensive capabilities." The accusation of treason struck Lydia like a physical blow, though she showed no external reaction. After everything she had sacrificed for her country, being suspected of working with enemy forces felt like the ultimate betrayal. But she understood their position. From their perspective, her knowledge was inexplicable and therefore suspicious. "You're right to be cautious," she admitted, her voice remaining steady despite the hurt in her eyes. "Operational security is important, but you're also running out of time and options. Your perimeter is collapsing, your communications are down, and your weapons are locked away by systems that are smarter than whoever programmed your standard override procedures." Mitchell grabbed her arm with the kind of firm grip that soldiers use to control potential threats. "That's enough. You're coming with us to holding until this situation is resolved, and we can properly investigate your background. Nobody should know that much about our security systems." As his fingers closed around her arm, Lydia looked directly into his eyes with an expression that seemed to shift from civilian compliance to something harder, more focused. "I'm trying to save your lives," she said quietly. "All of you. But if you're more interested in following protocols than surviving the next hour, that's your choice to make." The sound of explosions grew closer, rattling dust from the ceiling and reminding everyone that their theoretical discussion about security procedures was taking place while real enemies advanced toward their position. Outside the Armory, Fort Meridian's defenses were crumbling under assault by forces that had planned their attack with devastating effectiveness. It was at this moment of maximum tension, with Mitchell's hand gripping her arm and suspicion radiating from every face around her, that Lydia made the decision to abandon 3 years of carefully maintained anonymity and reveal the truth about who she really was. Lydia moved with fluid precision that seemed to emerge from nowhere, her body shifting in ways that transformed her from passive civilian to something entirely different. Mitchell's grip on her arm became leverage as she pivoted smoothly, using his own momentum to guide him into a controlled, off-balance position that left him startled but unharmed. The movement happened so quickly that the other soldiers barely registered it as anything more than an awkward stumble. "I need 60 seconds at that terminal," she said, her voice carrying a new quality, calm authority that cut through the chaos like a blade. Without waiting for permission, she walked directly to the main security console, her fingers hovering over the keyboard with the confident hesitation of someone who knew exactly what they were looking at. Torres raised her sidearm, training it on Lydia's back. "Stop right there. Step away from the console immediately." Her voice carried the sharp edge of someone prepared to use deadly force if necessary. "You are not authorized to access classified systems." But Lydia was already typing, her fingers moving across the keyboard, with speed and precision that spoke of extensive training and experience. Lines of code scrolled across the screen as she navigated through system directories that should have been inaccessible to anyone without advanced clearance levels. Her movements showed none of the tentative exploration of someone learning a new system. This was muscle memory in action. "She's accessing restricted files," Anderson reported, his voice tight with disbelief as he watched data streams that he didn't recognize flowing across multiple monitors. "Sir, she's in areas of the system that I've never seen before. How is that even possible?" Reynolds moved closer, studying the screens over Lydia's shoulder. What he saw defied everything he understood about the Armory's security architecture. She was navigating through system layers that he hadn't known existed, accessing diagnostic protocols that weren't covered in any manual he'd ever read. The code she was entering appeared to be written in programming languages that seemed more advanced than anything in their standard software packages. "These are administrative backdoors," she explained without looking away from her work. "Every major security system includes emergency access protocols for situations where normal authorization chains are compromised. The problem is that most installation commanders don't know they exist because they're designed for use by specialized technical teams during extreme circumstances." Mitchell stared at the scrolling data, trying to process what he was witnessing. How could a janitor know about administrative backdoors in military security systems? That's beyond classified. That's the kind of information that only exists at the highest levels of system development. Lydia's fingers paused briefly as she encountered a particularly complex section of code. Because whoever designed this attack was very good, but they made one critical assumption. They assumed that the people trying to regain access would follow standard military procedures and use conventional override methods. They didn't plan for someone who understands the underlying architecture from a different perspective. The screens began displaying system diagnostics that painted a clear picture of the cyber attack's methodology. Malicious code had indeed been inserted into the authentication systems, creating exactly the recursive loops that Lydia had described. But more importantly, the attack had overlooked several legacy access pathways that existed parallel to the main security architecture. Torres lowered her weapon slightly, confused by what she was observing. "The diagnostic data she's accessing, it's showing us exactly how the attack was structured. She's mapping their infiltration methods in real time." Her voice carried a mixture of suspicion and grudging respect. "But how would a civilian know how to run these kinds of diagnostics?" "Because I'm not just a civilian," Lydia replied, continuing her work as status indicators began changing from red to amber across multiple system displays. "And right now, the specifics of my background matter less than whether you want to access your weapons before hostile forces reach this building." Reynolds found himself torn between military protocol and practical necessity. Every instinct told him to stop Lydia and secure her for interrogation, but the evidence on his screen suggested that she was actually succeeding where his team had failed. The system displays were showing progress toward restored access, something they hadn't achieved in over an hour of conventional attempts. "Sir, look at Sector 7 authentication," Specialist Torres said, her voice filled with amazement. "She's bypassed 3 layers of corrupted security protocols and restored primary access to the small arms lockers. The systems are actually responding to her commands." A soft electronic chime indicated that the first weapon storage bay had unlocked. Mitchell moved immediately to the nearest rifle rack, finding that the electronic locks were indeed disengaged and the safety interlocks had been properly reset. "I don't believe it," he muttered, pulling an M4 carbine from the rack and checking its action. She actually did it. Lydia continued working, her concentration absolute as she navigated through increasingly complex system architectures. The heavy weapons storage will take another few minutes. They've layered the security differently there, probably because they understood that small arms wouldn't be enough to repel their attack effectively. Anderson watched in fascination as green status lights began appearing across the Armory's control panels. "Ma'am, how did you learn to do this? This isn't the kind of thing they teach in civilian technical schools." "No," Lydia agreed, finally looking up from her work as the main weapon storage systems began their unlocking sequences. "It isn't." Reynolds studied her face, seeing something in her expression that he hadn't noticed before, the kind of quiet confidence that came from experience under extreme pressure, the calm focus that he recognized from veteran soldiers who had been tested in combat situations. There was more to Lydia Hartwell than any of them had imagined. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. Before Lydia could answer, the sound of automatic weapons fire erupted from the corridor outside the Armory, much closer than before. The gunfire outside grew more intense, accompanied by the distinctive sound of tactical teams moving through corridors with practiced efficiency. Lydia's hands continued working at the console, but her posture had changed. Shoulders squared, head tilted slightly as she processed audio cues that would mean nothing to most civilians, but told a complete tactical story to someone with the right training. "Hostile forces are approximately 2 minutes from this position," she said, without looking up from her work, her voice carrying the calm precision of someone making a professional assessment rather than a panicked guess. "Based on movement patterns and weapon signatures, I estimate 8 to 10 operators using suppressed automatic weapons and coordinated advancement tactics." Reynolds stared at her, his mind struggling to process how a janitor could analyze combat sounds with the kind of tactical precision that took years of military training to develop. "How could you possibly know that?" Lydia's fingers flew across the keyboard as she worked to unlock the final weapon storage systems. "Because I've heard those movement patterns before. Russian-trained operators, probably Spetsnaz or equivalent private military contractors. They're using a standard building clearance formation, advancing in coordinated pairs while maintaining overwatch positions." The technical accuracy of her assessment sent chills through every soldier in the room. Torres had completed advanced courses in threat identification and enemy tactics, but she couldn't have provided such a detailed analysis based solely on audio cues from the corridor. The level of expertise Lydia was demonstrating went far beyond anything that civilian training could provide. "Ma'am," Mitchell said, his voice tight with urgency as he loaded his rifle and checked his equipment, "I need you to explain right now how you know so much about military tactics and enemy operational procedures. People's lives are at stake here." The heavy weapons storage bay finally unlocked with a series of electronic chimes, revealing racks of advanced military equipment that could turn the tide of any small unit engagement. But instead of celebrating their success, every soldier in the room found themselves staring at Lydia, waiting for an explanation that would make sense of everything they had witnessed. Lydia stood slowly from the console, her movements revealing a physical confidence that seemed completely at odds with the submissive civilian they had known for 3 years. Her eyes swept across the room, taking in defensive positions and tactical considerations with the kind of automatic assessment that marked professional soldiers. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You want to know who I am," she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there minutes before. "You want to understand how a janitor knows things that should be classified above your clearance levels." The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridor, accompanied by the low murmur of tactical communications in a language that none of the Americans recognized. Time was running out for explanations, but Reynolds found that he needed answers before he could trust Lydia with his team's lives. "Yes," he said simply, "right now." Lydia looked at each soldier in turn, seeing faces filled with suspicion, confusion, and desperate hope. These were good soldiers, professionals who deserved the truth about who they were about to fight alongside. After 3 years of carefully maintained anonymity, she was going to have to reveal everything. "My name is not Lydia Hartwell," she began, her voice growing stronger with each word. "That's a cover identity I've been using since I left military service. My real name is Captain Rachel Thorne, formerly of the Army's 1st Special Forces, Operational Detachment Delta." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Delta Force, officially known as Combat Applications Group, represented the pinnacle of American special operations capabilities. These were operators who handled the most classified missions, who trained constantly for scenarios that conventional forces couldn't manage, who disappeared from official records because their very existence was strategically sensitive. Torres dropped her weapon to her side, her mouth falling open. "Delta Force? You're claiming you were a Delta operator?" "I'm not claiming anything," Rachel replied, her civilian persona falling away like shed skin. "I served 8 years with CAG, specializing in electronic warfare and tactical systems infiltration. My call sign was Iron Phoenix. I participated in classified operations across 4 theaters of operations before I was medically retired following injuries sustained during a mission in Syria." The transformation was complete and undeniable. Where Lydia Hartwell had been submissive and forgettable, Rachel Thorne stood with the bearing of someone who had commanded elite soldiers in the world's most dangerous situations. Her voice carried authority earned through years of life-or-death decision-making. Her eyes showed the kind of tactical awareness that came from surviving combat against the world's most dangerous enemies. Mitchell lowered his rifle completely, his expression shifting from suspicion to amazement. "Iron Phoenix? You're Iron Phoenix." The recognition in his voice surprised Rachel. "You know that call sign?" "Know it?" Mitchell's voice was filled with awe. "Ma'am, every special operations soldier in the Army knows about Iron Phoenix. You're a legend. The electronic warfare specialist who single-handedly disabled an entire enemy communications network during the Kandahar operation. The operator who infiltrated that Syrian facility and extracted intelligence that prevented 3 major terrorist attacks." Anderson looked between Mitchell and Rachel, trying to process the magnitude of what he was learning. "Sir, you're saying that our janitor is one of the most decorated special operations soldiers in military history?" "Was," Rachel corrected. "I left that life behind 3 years ago. The person you knew as Lydia Hartwell represents who I chose to become after I couldn't be Captain Thorne anymore." Reynolds studied her face, seeing past the humble exterior to the steel underneath. "Why? Why give up a career like that to work as a janitor?" Rachel's expression grew distant for a moment, touched by memories that she had spent 3 years trying to forget. "Because sometimes the cost of being a warrior becomes too high to pay. Sometimes you lose people you care about, and the only way to honor their sacrifice is to choose a different kind of service." The sound of tactical communications grew closer, reminding everyone that their immediate survival depended on actions rather than explanations. Rachel moved toward the heavy weapons storage, her movements now showing the fluid efficiency of elite military training. "Right now, the details of my past matter less than whether you're willing to trust me to help you defend this base," she said, selecting equipment with the practiced eye of someone who understood exactly what each situation required, because those operators in the corridor are very good at what they do, and you're going to need every advantage you can get. The silence that followed Rachel's revelation stretched for several heartbeats, as the magnitude of her true identity settled over the team. Reynolds found himself mentally reviewing 3 years of interactions with someone he had dismissed as invisible support staff, realizing that he had been in the presence of military royalty without ever knowing it. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, reconciling the quiet janitor with stories of legendary special operations missions that were whispered about in military circles worldwide. Iron Phoenix conducted 17 classified operations with 0 mission failures and 0 friendly casualties, Torres said, her voice filled with the kind of reverence usually reserved for military heroes. They teach case studies of your electronic warfare techniques at advanced training schools. The Damascus infiltration is required reading for cyber warfare specialists. Mitchell stepped forward, his expression showing the profound respect that professional soldiers reserved for those who had achieved the impossible. Ma'am, I served with the 75th Ranger Regiment before transferring here. My unit provided support for one of your operations in Afghanistan, the one where you disabled an entire Taliban communications network while under direct fire. We never met the operator who made that mission possible, but the after-action reports describe tactical brilliance that saved dozens of American lives. Rachel felt the weight of their recognition, like a physical force. For 3 years, she had successfully buried Captain Rachel Thorne beneath the anonymous identity of Lydia Hartwell, hiding from the expectations and responsibilities that came with her reputation. But now, facing soldiers whose lives depended on her expertise, she couldn't maintain that pretense any longer. The media never reported the full scope of your service record, Anderson added, his youthful face showing amazement. But military intelligence briefings mentioned Iron Phoenix operations that prevented 3 major terrorist attacks on American soil. You're talking about someone who personally saved thousands of civilian lives. The revelation of Rachel's background explained everything that had seemed impossible about the previous hour. Her technical knowledge of electronic warfare systems, her tactical assessment of enemy movement patterns, her calm competence under extreme pressure, all of it made perfect sense when viewed through the lens of Delta Force training and experience. Reynolds studied her face, seeing past the humble exterior to the steel underneath. Captain Thorne, why did you leave active service? Someone with your record and capabilities doesn't just walk away from special operations. Rachel's expression grew distant as memories surfaced that she had spent 3 years trying to suppress. Operation Nightfall, Syria, 18 months ago. My team was tasked with infiltrating a facility believed to contain intelligence about planned attacks against European targets. The mission required someone with advanced electronic warfare skills to disable their security systems while the team extracted the data. The painful memories played across her face like shadows as she continued. Intelligence reports indicated minimal security presence, but the facility turned out to be heavily defended by professional operators who had anticipated our arrival. My team fought their way through 3 levels of resistance to complete the mission, but we were surrounded during extraction. Torres leaned forward, recognizing the haunted expression that she had seen in other veterans struggling with survivors' guilt. What happened to your team? I was the only one who made it out alive, Rachel said quietly. 7 of the finest soldiers I had ever served with died protecting me while I completed the electronic warfare objectives. They bought me time to finish uploading the intelligence data that prevented 3 coordinated attacks in London, Paris, and Berlin. Thousands of civilian lives were saved because of their sacrifice. The weight of survival guilt was evident in every word. Mitchell understood immediately. He had seen other soldiers struggle with the psychological burden of outliving their comrades, especially when their survival had served a larger strategic purpose that made their loss both meaningful and unbearable. The mission was classified as a complete success, Rachel continued. The intelligence we extracted led to the arrest of 47 terrorist operatives and prevented attacks that would have killed hundreds of innocent people. But success felt meaningless when measured against the cost of achieving it. Anderson tried to process the magnitude of what she had sacrificed. So you left special operations and became a janitor? Someone with your skills and experience chose to clean buildings instead of continuing to serve at the highest levels of military operations. I needed to find a way to serve that didn't require watching good people die for strategic objectives, Rachel explained. Custodial work at a military installation allowed me to stay connected to the military community while avoiding the kind of high-stakes operations that had cost me everyone I cared about. Reynolds began to understand the psychological journey that had led Captain Rachel Thorne to become Lydia Hartwell. You chose anonymity as a form of penance. You wanted to serve without the recognition or responsibility that came with your reputation. Something like that, Rachel admitted. For 3 years, I found peace in taking care of the basic needs that keep military installations functioning. Cleaning, maintenance, ensuring that soldiers had safe and sanitary environments. It felt like a way to protect people without putting them in danger. The sound of tactical communications in the corridor grew more distinct, reminding everyone that their philosophical discussion was taking place while hostile forces advanced toward their position. But the revelation of Rachel's background had fundamentally changed the dynamic in the room. They were no longer dealing with an unauthorized civilian whose knowledge seemed inexplicable. They were receiving assistance from one of the most capable special operations soldiers in American military history. "Captain," Torres said, using Rachel's military rank for the first time, "what do you need from us to defend this position effectively?" The question represented complete acceptance of her authority and expertise. After 3 years of invisibility, Rachel found herself once again responsible for the lives of soldiers who were looking to her for leadership and tactical guidance. "First, we need to establish defensive positions that take advantage of the Armory's layout," she replied, her voice shifting into the professional tone of someone briefing combat operations. "Second, we need to coordinate with any surviving base personnel to maximize our defensive effectiveness. And third, we need to prepare for the possibility that this is only the beginning of a larger operation." The transformation in the soldiers' demeanor was immediate and profound. Where moments before they had viewed Rachel with suspicion and treated her as a potential security threat, now they looked to her with the kind of respect and deference that elite operators earned through proven competence under fire. The shift was so complete that it seemed to alter the very atmosphere in the Armory, replacing uncertainty with focused determination. Reynolds straightened to attention, his body language unconsciously shifting to the formal bearing that soldiers adopted when addressing superior officers. "Captain Thorne, what are your orders?" The question carried weight that went far beyond simple courtesy. He was formally acknowledging her tactical authority and requesting guidance from someone whose expertise exceeded anything their training had prepared them for. Mitchell moved immediately to the heavy weapons storage, selecting equipment with the efficiency of someone who understood that their survival depended on rapid preparation. "Ma'am, how do you want to structure our defensive positions? The Armory has 3 potential entry points, but the main corridor offers the best fields of fire for coordinated defense." Torres began checking communication equipment, her fingers moving with renewed purpose as she worked to establish contact with surviving base personnel. "Captain, I'm getting intermittent signals from scattered units throughout the facility. It sounds like Colonel Hawkins is coordinating resistance from the emergency command center, but their position is becoming untenable." The reverence in their voices reflected more than simple military protocol. These soldiers were experiencing the rare privilege of serving alongside someone whose reputation had reached mythical status within special operations communities. Iron Phoenix wasn't just a call sign, it was a symbol of tactical excellence that represented the pinnacle of what American Special Forces could achieve. Anderson, despite his youth and relative inexperience, seemed to grow more confident simply by being in Rachel's presence. "Ma'am, should I attempt to establish communication with friendly forces outside the base? If we can coordinate with regional command, we might be able to call in air support or backup units." Rachel studied the tactical display screens, her mind automatically processing defensive options with the kind of systematic analysis that had made her legendary among military strategists. Negative on external communications. The hostile force planned this operation specifically to isolate Fort Meridian from outside support. Any radio traffic we generate will be monitored and could compromise defensive positions. The soldiers absorbed her guidance with the focused attention of students learning from a master tactician. Every word carried authority earned through successful operations in the world's most dangerous environments. They understood that they were receiving tactical instruction from someone who had faced similar situations and emerged victorious. "The Armory's layout provides natural defensive advantages," Rachel continued, her voice taking on the professional tone of someone conducting an operational briefing. "Reinforced concrete construction, limited access points, and protected sight lines that favor defenders over attackers. But we need to assume that the hostile force has detailed intelligence about this facility's layout and capabilities." Reynolds nodded, his strategic thinking aligning with her assessment. "They've demonstrated knowledge of our security systems and electronic infrastructure. It's reasonable to assume they've also studied our defensive positions and tactical vulnerabilities." Torres looked up from her communication equipment with an expression of growing admiration. "Captain, I'm monitoring enemy tactical frequencies. They're using sophisticated encryption and communication protocols that suggest professional military training at the highest levels. How should we counter their coordination advantages?" The question demonstrated complete trust in Rachel's tactical judgment. These soldiers, who had spent months struggling with conventional responses to an unconventional threat, were now looking to her for solutions that their standard training hadn't provided. "Electronic warfare is about understanding your enemy's capabilities and exploiting their weaknesses," Rachel explained, moving to the communication console with the fluid confidence of someone who had mastered these systems through years of operational experience. Professional operators rely on constant communication to maintain tactical coordination. If we can disrupt their ability to communicate effectively, we can force them to operate as individuals rather than a coordinated team. Mitchell watched in fascination as Rachel's fingers moved across the electronic warfare equipment with the same precision she had shown while unlocking the weapon storage systems. "Ma'am, can we actually jam their communications without affecting our own defensive coordination?" "Better than that," Rachel replied, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who understood electronic warfare at a level that few military specialists ever achieved. "We can insert false signals into their communication network that will create confusion about tactical objectives and friendly positions." The soldiers exchanged glances that reflected amazement at the sophistication of the warfare techniques she was describing. This wasn't conventional military tactics. This was the kind of advanced operational methodology that was taught only at the highest levels of Special Forces training. Anderson shook his head in disbelief. "Captain, how long did it take you to master these kinds of advanced techniques? This is beyond anything they covered in our technical training programs." 8 years of constant learning, Rachel answered honestly. "Delta Force selection is just the beginning. The real education happens during operational deployments, where theory meets reality and you learn what actually works under extreme pressure." Torres studied the tactical displays that Rachel was configuring, trying to understand the strategic thinking behind her defensive preparations. "Ma'am, what makes you confident that we can hold this position against professional operators who have already demonstrated superior planning and execution?" Rachel paused in her work, looking directly at each soldier with an expression that conveyed both honesty and determination. "Because professional soldiers, no matter how well trained, make tactical assumptions based on conventional responses to conventional threats. They've planned this operation assuming they would face standard military procedures and predictable defensive patterns." Reynolds began to understand the strategic advantage that Rachel's presence provided. "But you're not going to respond conventionally." "Exactly," Rachel confirmed. "They've studied Fort Meridian's defensive capabilities and planned countermeasures for every standard response. But they haven't planned for resistance organized by someone with Delta Force training who understands electronic warfare, tactical deception, and unconventional defensive strategies." The confidence in her voice was infectious, transforming the soldiers' desperation into focused determination. They were no longer simply trying to survive an overwhelming attack. They were preparing to turn the tables on an enemy force that had underestimated their defensive capabilities. The battle for the Armory began at precisely 03:17 hours when the first breach charge detonated against the reinforced entrance. The explosion sent a shockwave through the concrete structure, but Rachel's defensive preparations had anticipated exactly this kind of assault. Instead of the coordinated room clearing that the attackers expected, they found themselves facing a killing field that had been meticulously prepared by someone who understood their tactics better than they understood themselves. Rachel's electronic warfare countermeasures activated simultaneously with the breach. The false signals she had inserted into the enemy communication network created immediate confusion among the attacking force. Their tactical coordinators received contradictory reports about defensive positions, friendly casualties, and objective priorities. Instead of the surgical precision that had characterized their assault on the base perimeter, they found themselves operating with degraded intelligence and conflicting orders. "Contact front," Reynolds called out as the first hostile operators appeared through the smoke and debris of the breached entrance. His rifle fire was precise and controlled, targeting movement patterns that Rachel had predicted based on her analysis of their tactical approach. The defensive positions she had selected provided perfect overlapping fields of fire while keeping the defending soldiers protected behind reinforced cover. Torres worked the electronic warfare console with deadly efficiency, jamming enemy frequencies while maintaining clear communication channels for the defending team. Her technical training, combined with Rachel's advanced knowledge of signal warfare, created a communication advantage that completely reversed the tactical situation. "Their coordination is breaking down," she reported. "I'm intercepting fragments of confused status reports and requests for clarification of objectives." The attacking force had expected to face conventional military resistance, predictable defensive positions, standard communication protocols, and tactical responses that followed established military doctrine. Instead, they encountered a defense organized by someone who understood their methods and had prepared countermeasures that exploited every weakness in their operational planning. Mitchell engaged targets with the confidence that came from fighting alongside someone whose tactical brilliance was legendary. The heavy weapons that Rachel had unlocked gave them firepower advantages that the attackers hadn't anticipated. "They're falling back to regroup," he observed, watching enemy operators retreat under withering defensive fire. Their assault pattern assumed lighter resistance and faster penetration. But Rachel understood that the initial repulsion was only the beginning. Professional military contractors didn't abandon operations after encountering unexpected resistance. They adapted their tactics and returned with modified approaches that accounted for new intelligence about defensive capabilities. "They'll analyze our response patterns and adjust their next assault accordingly," she warned, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had faced similar situations multiple times. Professional operators learn from failure and modify their tactics in real time. We need to assume they'll return with different approaches that account for what they've learned. Anderson monitored base-wide communications, reporting fragmented updates from other defensive positions throughout Fort Meridian. "Captain, I'm picking up scattered reports from surviving units. It sounds like our defense here has inspired other positions to mount more effective resistance. Colonel Hawkins is coordinating a counterattack from the Emergency Command Center." The psychological impact of successful resistance was spreading throughout the base. Soldiers, who had been falling back under overwhelming pressure, were now fighting with renewed determination, inspired by reports that the Armory was not only holding but actively degrading enemy capabilities through sophisticated electronic warfare. "The hostile force made a critical strategic error," Rachel explained as she monitored their tactical frequencies and analyzed their communication patterns. "They planned this operation assuming that Fort Meridian's defenders would respond predictably to conventional assault tactics. But they didn't account for the possibility that their electronic warfare advantages could be neutralized by someone with superior technical knowledge." Torres looked up from her console with an expression of amazement. "Captain, you've completely turned their communication advantages against them. They're using encrypted frequencies, but you've found ways to insert false data that's causing cascade failures in their coordination protocols." The second assault began 15 minutes later, but the attacking force had lost the element of surprise and tactical coordination that had made their initial base penetration so successful. Their operators were now fighting as individuals rather than a coordinated team, forced to rely on visual signals and basic tactical procedures instead of the sophisticated communication networks that professional military units required for complex operations. Reynolds coordinated defensive fire with the precision of someone who had trained extensively for close-quarters combat, but he was fighting with confidence that came from knowing that his tactical leader understood the enemy better than they understood themselves. They're using different entry points now, but their movement patterns are still predictable, based on standard assault doctrine. Rachel had anticipated the tactical modifications that professional operators would implement after analyzing their initial failure. Her defensive preparations included multiple contingency positions and overlapping fields of fire that would be effective regardless of which approach the enemy chose for their second attempt. Mitchell engaged targets with devastating effectiveness, using the advanced weapons systems that Rachel had unlocked to create defensive firepower that far exceeded anything the attackers had planned to encounter. "Ma'am, their assault is losing momentum. They're taking casualties and falling back again without achieving penetration objectives." The battle continued for another 30 minutes, with the attacking force making increasingly desperate attempts to breach the Armory's defenses. But each assault was met by tactical responses that demonstrated superior planning, better equipment coordination, and electronic warfare capabilities that neutralized their technical advantages. Torres monitored enemy communications throughout the engagement, providing real-time intelligence about their tactical modifications and strategic thinking. Captain, their field commanders are reporting mission failure and requesting permission to abort the operation. They're taking casualties without making meaningful progress toward their objectives. At 0352 hours, the hostile force began a coordinated withdrawal from Fort Meridian. Their carefully planned assault had been defeated by defensive tactics that exceeded their contingency planning and electronic warfare capabilities that they couldn't counter with their available resources. The base that they had expected to capture within 2 hours had become a tactical nightmare that cost them personnel and equipment while achieving none of their operational goals. Rachel monitored their withdrawal through electronic surveillance, ensuring that the retreat was genuine rather than a tactical deception designed to lure defenders into pursuing them into prepared ambush positions. "They're extracting to predetermined rally points," she reported. "This appears to be a genuine operational failure rather than tactical repositioning." The immediate aftermath of the battle found Fort Meridian transformed in ways that went far beyond damaged buildings and scattered equipment. As dawn broke over the installation, casting golden light through the smoke that still drifted from various points around the base, the psychological landscape had shifted fundamentally. Word of Iron Phoenix's return had spread through military communication networks with the speed of wildfire, carrying implications that reached far beyond the tactical success of defending a single armory. Rachel stood in the early morning light outside the armory, still wearing her custodial coveralls, but no soldier who looked at her saw a janitor anymore. The transformation was complete and irreversible. The quiet woman who had emptied their trash and cleaned their floors for 3 years was revealed as one of the most legendary special operations soldiers in American military history. The cognitive dissonance was profound and lasting. Colonel Hawkins approached her with the measured pace of someone who understood that she was about to have a conversation that would be remembered and analyzed for years to come. The base commander had spent the remainder of the night coordinating damage assessment and casualty reports, but her immediate priority was understanding how the most critical defensive position on her base had been successfully held by a cleaning lady whose personnel file contained nothing that suggested military experience. "Captain Thorne," she said, using Rachel's military rank with the kind of respect that acknowledged both her service record and her decisive role in saving Fort Meridian. "I've spent the last 4 hours reviewing classified files that I didn't know existed. The Department of Defense has very little official documentation about Iron Phoenix operations, but what I've been able to access suggests that you were responsible for some of the most successful counterterrorism missions in recent military history." Rachel nodded quietly, accepting the recognition without the enthusiasm that might have been expected from someone whose heroic actions were finally being acknowledged. 3 years of anonymity had taught her to value substance over recognition, service over glory. "Colonel, I chose to leave that identity behind for reasons that I hope you can understand. Captain Thorne accomplished important missions, but the cost of those accomplishments became too high for me to continue paying." Hawkins studied her face, recognizing the survivor's guilt that she had seen in other veterans who had lost comrades during classified operations. "I understand that you've been dealing with trauma related to your service. What I don't understand is why someone with your capabilities chose to work as custodial staff instead of seeking appropriate mental health support and returning to active duty where your skills could serve the national interest." The question touched on psychological territory that Rachel had spent 3 years navigating. Her choice to become Lydia Hartwell hadn't been about avoiding responsibility or escaping from her military obligations. It had been about finding a way to continue serving while protecting herself from the kind of high-stakes operations that had cost her everyone she cared about. Sometimes the best way to serve is to find roles where you can protect people without putting them in danger, she explained. Custodial work at a military installation allowed me to contribute to mission readiness while avoiding the kind of tactical responsibilities that had led to devastating personal losses. Reynolds approached the conversation with the deference that soldiers showed when addressing officers whose reputations exceeded their own understanding of what was possible in military service. Ma'am, with respect, your decision to remain at Fort Meridian probably saved this entire installation. If you hadn't been here when the attack occurred, we would have lost access to our weapons and defensive capabilities. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Rachel's attempt to avoid high-stakes military situations had led her directly into exactly the kind of tactical scenario that had made Iron Phoenix legendary. Her efforts to escape from her special operations background had positioned her to use those very skills to save the lives of soldiers who had unknowingly worked alongside one of their most accomplished peers. Torres joined the group, carrying electronic equipment that she had used throughout the night to monitor enemy communications and coordinate with regional military commands. Captain, I've been analyzing the attack methodology and comparing it to known patterns of professional military contractors. The level of sophistication suggests state-sponsored operations rather than independent terrorist activities. The assessment raised strategic implications that extended far beyond Fort Meridian's immediate security concerns. If the attack had been conducted by professional operators working for foreign intelligence services, then Rachel's successful defense had prevented more than just a tactical victory for hostile forces. She had potentially disrupted larger strategic operations that could have compromised national security interests. Mitchell approached with the kind of quiet respect that professional soldiers reserved for individuals whose achievements transcended normal military recognition. Ma'am, the weapon systems that you unlocked and the defensive tactics you implemented, they weren't just about protecting this base. You demonstrated capabilities that proved American Special Operations training produces soldiers who can defeat any enemy force regardless of their planning or technical advantages. The implications of Iron Phoenix's return resonated through military communities at multiple levels. Young soldiers who had heard legendary stories about Delta Force operations now understood that they had been working alongside someone whose actual accomplishments exceeded the mythical accounts. Veteran officers who had participated in operations that benefited from Iron Phoenix intelligence gathering realized that they owed their mission successes to someone who had chosen to clean their buildings rather than accept recognition for her contributions. Anderson, despite his youth and limited experience, seemed to grasp the broader significance of what had occurred. Captain, soldiers throughout the military are going to know that Iron Phoenix didn't disappear, that you've been serving in a different capacity while dealing with personal challenges related to your combat service. That's going to change how people think about service and sacrifice. Rachel considered the long-term implications of her revealed identity. For 3 years, she had successfully maintained anonymity that allowed her to serve without the expectations and responsibilities that came with her reputation. But the events of the previous night had made continued invisibility impossible. Every soldier at Fort Meridian now knew who she was, and military communication networks were already spreading news of Iron Phoenix's return throughout special operations communities. I understand that my anonymity is no longer possible, she acknowledged, but I hope that people will understand my choice to continue serving in this capacity rather than returning to active special operations duty. Colonel Hawkins smiled with the kind of understanding that came from years of working with soldiers who had made difficult personal choices about how to balance service obligations with psychological well-being. Captain, I think you'll find that your choice to remain at Fort Meridian is seen as honorable rather than unusual. You've demonstrated that service takes many forms, and sometimes the most valuable contributions come from people who choose substance over recognition. Rachel looked around the base that had become her home for 3 years, seeing familiar buildings and landscapes with new understanding. She was no longer Lydia Hartwell, the janitor, but she didn't need to become Captain Rachel Thorne again either. She could find a middle path that honored both identities while continuing to serve in ways that protected the people she cared about. The story of the janitor who saved Fort Meridian would become legendary within military circles, but Rachel knew that the real victory wasn't tactical or strategic, it was personal. She had learned that running from her past wasn't necessary, that she could integrate her military experience with her civilian service, and that heroism didn't require choosing between recognition and anonymity. Sometimes the most important battles were fought by people whose names would never appear in official reports, whose contributions would be remembered in the quiet gratitude of those whose lives they had saved. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.